the most wonderful time of the year. That's what they call it. I grew up in a small town in rural Vermont, a place where winter was a real, tangible presence, and Christmas wasn't just a holiday. It was a season of hunkering down and holding on. My grandfather had a cabin deep in the woods, a place without cell service, without a TV, just a wood stove and the deafening silence of a snow-covered landscape. We'd go every Christmas Eve, a family tradition that was supposed to be a cozy escape. The first time I felt it, I was 12. We were sitting around the fire, my parents, my older brother, and me, and I felt a sudden, deep chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. It was a cold that seemed to come from inside the cabin, from the very walls themselves. My brother gave me a weird look, and I knew he felt it too. I remember my mom just shivered and said, "Must be a draft." But there was no draft, and the faint sound I heard, just a single, sharp jingle, like a bell, was something I kept to myself. The strange occurrences began to escalate the following year. I was a little older, a little more aware. We were at the cabin, and it was snowing hard, a blizzard that had trapped us for the night. The power was out, so we were using oil lamps, and the fire was roaring. My mom was humming a Christmas tune as she read a book, and that's when I saw it. The gingerbread men hanging from the tree. They weren't a fresh batch. They were ones we had made the year before and had hung up again for tradition. There were 8 of them, all in a row. As I watched, one of them, the one on the far end, slowly began to turn on its thread. It turned and turned and turned, facing away from the fire, and then it stopped. A few minutes later, another one started to turn. It wasn't the heat from the fire, I checked, and it wasn't a draft. I just sat there, watching as each gingerbread man, one by one, slowly rotated away from the warmth and the light, until they were all facing the wall. I told my brother, but he just laughed and said I was being paranoid. The next morning, they were all facing the right way again. It started to feel like the cabin was alive, and it didn't want us there. I'd be trying to sleep, listening to the wind and the fire, and I'd hear a sound like a small, hollow tapping, coming from the walls, from the floorboards, from the ceiling. It was too regular to be an animal. Tap, 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 and sometimes it would be followed by a soft, dry whisper, like a secret being told in a language made of dust. My parents never heard it, or at least, they never said they did. The third Christmas we went back to the cabin, the sense of dread was almost unbearable. I was now 15, and my brother and I had a silent understanding. We'd go to bed, and the tapping would begin, and we'd lie in the dark, our eyes wide open, just waiting for the next sound. This time, it wasn't just the gingerbread men. We had a string of lights, a battery-powered one, and it would flicker in the most unnatural way, not like a bad connection, but in a slow, pulsing rhythm. On, off, and as it pulsed, the faint, distorted sound of the carol I had heard years before would play, just for a second, then vanish. I remember one night, I had to use the outhouse. It was freezing, the snow was past my knees, and the wind was howling. The outhouse was a small, ramshackle building about 20 yards from the cabin, and I had a headlamp to light my way. As I was heading back, my headlamp beam caught something by the tree line. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still. It was dark, a shadow against the white snow. I froze, my breath a cloud in the air. As I watched, the figure slowly lifted its arm, and I saw something glinting in the faint light, a single silver bell, like the kind you hang on a door. The figure shook its arm, and the bell rang, not a friendly jingle, but a single, sharp, piercing sound that cut through the silence of the woods. It rang, and the figure took a single, unnatural step forward. Its movements were all wrong, too slow, too jerky, like a marionette with a broken string. I turned and ran, not back to the outhouse, but straight into the cabin, slamming the door and sliding the bolt home. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. The climax came the next day, Christmas Eve. The snow had stopped, and a strange, almost silent stillness had fallen over the woods. My brother and I were alone in the main room, my parents in their bedroom. The fire was low. We heard the sound then, a single, sharp scraping noise coming from the window. We both looked. The figure I had seen the night before was there, not in a menacing way, but it was at the window, its face pressed against the glass. It was not a person. It was an entity, a thing made of dried branches and woven straw, its head a crude, hollow gourd. It had 2 glowing orange points where its eyes should have been, and in one of its twig-like hands, it held a bundle of something. I looked at the window, and I saw a new detail. The glass was so old and thin, it was almost like a mirror, and I could see my own terrified face reflected back at me, but superimposed over the reflection was the faintest image of a child's face, weeping, its mouth open in a silent scream. The thing at the window pressed its face closer, and a faint whisper came through the glass, a dry, rustling sound that said, "Let me in." It slowly lifted its other hand, the one holding the bundle, and I saw what it was. It was a small, perfectly preserved gingerbread man, identical to the ones on our tree, only this one had a single, black ribbon tied around its waist. The creature placed the gingerbread man on the windowsill, and then it pointed a single, impossibly long finger at my brother and me, and its glowing eyes seemed to bore into us. The silence was broken only by a single, sharp, almost human cry that seemed to come from the gingerbread man on the sill. My brother and I screamed and scrambled backwards, stumbling over furniture and knocking over the poker. My parents burst into the room and turned on their lanterns. The creature at the window was gone. The gingerbread man was gone. My parents saw our terror and assumed it was a prank, a story, a figment of our imaginations. But my brother and I knew the truth. We refused to go back to the cabin. I still have no idea what that thing was, what it wanted, or what was in that bundle. But I've since learned that in certain parts of New England, there are old folk tales about a creature that visits homes during the deepest part of winter, a wicker man or branch witch who comes for children who have been promised to it. I'll never know if that's what it was, or what it was a manifestation of. All I know is that every Christmas now, I leave a gingerbread man on my windowsill, a single solitary figure facing out into the dark. I do it because I'm afraid of what might come if I don't, and I still hear, sometimes on a silent night, that single, lonely jingle of a bell. Halloween in my hometown in rural Ohio was always a big deal, not because of big parties or elaborate haunted houses, but because of the local legend of the whispering scarecrows. They were a permanent fixture in the fields surrounding our small town. Old, crudely made figures that local farmers would put up every year. They weren't scary, just a part of the landscape. As a kid, my friends and I would ride our bikes past them, daring each other to touch them, laughing at their ragged clothes and button eyes. They were just objects. But my grandfather, a man who had lived his entire life in that area, always had a deep respect for them. "Don't mess with the scarecrows," he'd tell me. "They're not for scaring birds. They're for scaring something else." I never asked him what he meant, because I didn't think there was anything to mean. The stories were just that, stories. It was all part of the Halloween fun, and the scarecrows were nothing more than a creepy backdrop to the autumn chill. The weirdness started when I was in high school. The first sign was when I started to notice how many of them there were. One year, there were a few dozen in the fields. The next, it seemed like there were twice as many. And they were different. Some were still the simple, cross-shaped figures, but others were more elaborate, almost human-shaped. One had a crude wooden face carved from a log, with 2 holes for eyes that seemed to follow you. Another had a tattered dress and a bundle of straw for a head. They were more unsettling now, less like props and more like sentinels. The whispers came next, not from the scarecrows themselves, but from the air around them. On a crisp October night, when the wind was still, I'd be walking home and pass by a field, and I'd hear it, a low, sibilant sound, like someone breathing through clenched teeth. It would rise and fall, a quiet, almost musical hiss, and it always seemed to be saying my name, or a fragmented version of it. I'd stop, and the sound would stop. I'd take a step, and it would start again. It was a phantom sound, something that my brain heard but my ears couldn't place. I mentioned it to my friend, who just told me I was hearing things, but I wasn't. I knew I wasn't. The whispers weren't malicious. They were more like a greeting, a form of acknowledgement. The scarecrows had seen me. The true dread began when the scarecrows began to move. I know how that sounds, and I don't mean they walked. They would be in one spot, and the next day, they would be in another. I was driving home from a late-night football game, and I saw a scarecrow that I knew was near the road. But now it was standing in the middle of an open field, its arms outstretched in a welcoming gesture. It was impossible. There was no way anyone could have moved it so fast and so far. The feeling of being watched became a constant state of being. No matter where I was, I felt the dozens of unseen eyes on me. I'd be looking out my bedroom window at night, and I'd see a new scarecrow in the field across the street, a tall, gaunt figure that hadn't been there before. It was just standing there, its dark form a stark contrast to the pale moonlight. The sound of the wind was gone, replaced by the sound of the whispers, and they weren't saying my name anymore. They were saying something else. Something about the offering and the harvest. My grandfather had told me once that the farmers had a pact, an old tradition, to put up the scarecrows to protect the fields. But now I was starting to understand that they weren't protecting the fields from something. They were protecting something for the fields. The climax arrived on Halloween night. I was a senior in high school, and I had stayed home, too unnerved to go out with my friends. The house was empty, and the air was thick with a strange stillness. I was in my room when I heard the tapping. Not a loud, aggressive sound, but a soft, rhythmic tapping, like dry wood on glass. I went downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest, and looked out the front window. A scarecrow was standing on my front lawn. Not just any scarecrow. It was the one from the field across the street, the tall, gaunt figure. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was a real scarecrow, its burlap sack head and straw hands rustling in the wind that I couldn't feel. It was tapping at the window with a long, thin twig. Its head was cocked to the side, as if it were listening for a response. As I watched in silent horror, I saw a small, dark bundle hanging from its other hand. It was about the size of a doll, and it was wrapped in a small piece of burlap. The creature at the window slowly lifted the bundle, and I could feel a new, powerful feeling in the air. A feeling of an old, deep hunger. The whispering in the air was now a clear, distinct chorus, and it was chanting a single word: welcome. The scarecrow held the bundle up, and I saw a small, pale hand with a single, slender finger sticking out from a tear in the burlap. It was the hand of a child, and it was pointing directly at me. The whispering grew louder, and the sound of the wind, which I now realized was coming from the scarecrow itself, began to sound like a low, hollow laugh. I stumbled backwards, falling over a chair, my hands clamped over my ears, trying to block out the sound of the whispers and the tapping. When I finally found the courage to look again, the scarecrow was gone, but something was left behind on the doorstep. A small bundle of burlap, identical to the one the scarecrow had been holding. I never opened it. I couldn't. My parents came home later, and I told them I had heard something. They dismissed it as my imagination, a Halloween trick, but I knew better. I packed my bags that night and left. I never went back to that town. I still don't know what the scarecrows are, what they are protecting, and what that offering was meant to be. But every year on Halloween, I turn off all the lights and lock all the doors and wait. I wait to hear the whispers, and I wait for the sound of the tapping, because I know that somewhere, in a field far away, a new scarecrow has been put up, and it is looking for me. The roads out here in the deserts of Nevada are a strange kind of empty. It's a vacuum of silence where your own thoughts feel loud and the darkness feels like a physical presence. I was on a long, solitary drive, heading east, toward Utah, my rig, the only moving thing for miles. It was late, past midnight, and I was deep into that exhausted, meditative state that long-haul drivers know. My mind was numb, but my eyes were sharp, scanning the long black ribbon of asphalt for any sign of a car or animal. That's when I saw it. Just a faint shape in the middle of the road, too small to be a person, too large to be an animal. I slowed down, squinting into the darkness. As my headlights got closer, I saw what it was. A doll. A small, old-fashioned porcelain doll in a frilly white dress, sitting upright in the middle of the empty road. My heart sank. There was no way to avoid it without swerving and risking a crash. I slowed to a crawl and drove right over it, feeling a small, sickening crunch under the wheels of my trailer. I felt a chill, a deep, profound coldness, even in the warmth of the cab. I had just run over a child's toy, a harmless porcelain doll, and I felt a sense of dread that was utterly disproportionate to the event. The unsettling feeling grew. A few miles down the road, I saw a flicker of white light on a rock. As I got closer, I saw it was the doll. It was sitting on a large, flat rock on the side of the highway, facing me, its dress slightly torn, its little porcelain face unmarked. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my hands ached. It was impossible. There was no one else on this road. My mind, tired and frayed, tried to come up with 1,000 explanations, but none of them made sense. I hit the gas, determined to leave this terrifying coincidence behind. But the coincidences kept coming. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and I saw a reflection in the glass. The doll, sitting on the hood of my truck, its little porcelain head tilted to the side. I whipped my head forward, but my hood was empty. I looked in the mirror again, and the doll was gone. It was just an optical illusion, a trick of the light, I told myself. I felt a new coldness, a familiar chill, coming from the back of my cab. I heard a sound then, a faint, high-pitched giggle that seemed to echo in the dead silence of the truck. It was a child's laugh, light and airy, and it was coming from the back seat. The terror escalated into a full-blown panic. I was speeding down the road, my foot pressed to the floor, but the laughter was still there, now joined by the faint, rhythmic sound of a tapping, like a single fingernail on wood. Tap, tap, tap. I looked in my rearview mirror, and I saw a new detail. The curtains in the back of my cab, which were always tied back, were swaying gently, as if something was pushing on them from behind. The laughter was now a continuous high-pitched giggle, and the tapping was getting faster, more frantic. I felt a single, cold drop of something on the back of my neck. I froze. I was so terrified I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever was in the cab with me wasn't a hallucination. I looked into the rearview mirror, and in the faint light of the dashboard, I saw it. The doll? It was no longer in the back seat. It was sitting on top of my headrest, its frilly dress clean and pristine, its porcelain face turned to look at me. The laughter was coming from the doll, a quiet, almost soundless giggling that seemed to vibrate in the air. Its button eyes, which had been blank, seemed to now hold a terrible, ancient intelligence. The climax was a single, terrifying, final moment. The doll, its head turned to look at me, slowly began to move its little porcelain lips. There was no sound, but I could hear a single, high-pitched whisper in my mind, a cold, dry voice that said, "You can't leave me." Then, it slowly lifted its tiny porcelain hand, its fingers stained with what looked like black oily mud, and reached out toward my face. I screamed, a raw animal sound of pure, unadulterated terror. I veered the truck off the road, not caring about the sand or the rocks, my hands shaking on the wheel. I brought the rig to a screeching halt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I threw open the cab door and scrambled out, falling to the ground in a sobbing mess. I crawled on my hands and knees until I was a safe distance away. I looked back, and in the faint moonlight, I saw my rig. The cab door was open. I didn't see the doll, but I heard a single, final, high-pitched giggle come from inside. The cab door slowly, deliberately, began to swing shut on its own. I never went back to that truck. I left it there, in the middle of the desert, and I walked to the nearest town. I never drove a rig again. The memory of that doll still haunts me. I have no idea what it was, or what it wanted, but I know that some things, some objects, are not just things. They are vessels for something else, and when you drive alone in the dark, you risk becoming a new vessel for a soul that has been lost for a very, very long time.